Welcome, everyone, to Testing Search Performance in Evidence Synthesis, the role of known relevant studies. I'm Alyssa Grimshaw, a biomedical research and methodology librarian here at the Yale Harvey Cushing John Hay Whitney Medical Library. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that doesn't get nearly as much attention as databases, search strings, or screening software, but it really has a huge impact on the search quality: known relevant studies. Many researchers can tell me that they want a comprehensive search, but fewer can explain how they know whether a search is performing well or not. Known relevant studies are one of the few practical tools we have for developing, testing, and improving evidence synthesis searches. Throughout this session, we'll look at how these studies can help us identify terminology, improve search strategies, and evaluate whether our searches are capturing the evidence we would expect to find. By the end of today's session, you should understand how known relevant studies can be used throughout the search process. We'll discuss how to identify useful studies, how to use them when building the search strategy, and how to use them as a quality assurance tool before finalizing a search. We'll also discuss some of the limitations because while these studies are valuable, they're not a perfect measure of search quality. I always like to take a second every single time I do an evidence synthesis lecture and just talk about library resources and services that are available here at the Yale Medical Library. So librarians are available to collaborate on reviews as a consultant or a co-author. In the consultant role, we take on more of a question and answer role where we can answer your questions and give you guidance or point you in the direction of resources that can be helpful. As a co-author, we become fully embedded in your team and we can do some of these items here or all of them depending on the level of support that you're looking for. To request co-author collaboration with the library, please fill out the form linked here, or just reach out to us and we can have a chat, and we can talk about your project. There is also tools available here at Yale, and so EndNote is available in the Yale software library to download, and Covidence, you would actually fill out the same form as above, and we would set up a project for you. For more information, please check out our website to look at our evidence synthesis service. I'd like to start with a simple question. Imagine you run a search and retrieve 10,000 articles. How do you know it's a good search? Is it exhaustive? Is it capturing everything that you need? Many researchers assume that retrieving a large number of citations means that the search is comprehensive. Others assume that a highly specific search is better because it produces fewer irrelevant results. Neither of those things necessarily tell us whether we found the studies that matter. The challenge in evidence synthesis is that we don't know what we haven't found. So we need ways to assess the search performance despite that uncertainty. When we talk about evidence synthesis searches, we're generally trying to maximize sensitivity so that relevant literature won't be missed. I often describe this as like dredging the bottom of a pond, right? So we're really getting deep into the parts of the database that we maybe wouldn't necessarily look at or we wouldn't see because we're creating such a comprehensive search. But we want to include all of that information if it's pulling in relevant results. We don't want to get, so broad that nothing that those words are adding in the search strategy are pulling in relevant results. So it's definitely a balance between precision and sensitivity. And we want, with evidence synthesis, we definitely want searches that are transparent, reproducible, and comprehensive enough to identify all of the relevant evidence. But when we're on this side of the project, it can be really hard when we're drafting the search strategy to know whether or not we've hit that comprehension level. And another problem is there's no one database that contains a complete list of all relevant studies for most review questions. You often have to, screen through the results to generate that. And we're going across different databases that would have, different search functionality within them. Because we can't measure everything we missed, we need an alternative approach for assessing search quality. Why start with studies you already know? They can help us understand how researchers describe the topic, identify important terminology, uncover subject headings assigned by databases, and find additional studies through citation chasing. Perhaps most importantly, they give us a way to test our search strategy. If a search fails to retrieve studies that we already know are relevant, that's a sign that we need to revisit the search strategy before moving forward. It's not exhaustive enough. You may hear a lot of different terms that all essentially mean the same thing. And for the context of this talk, I'm going to use all of them interchangeably. So if you hear any of these, know I'm talking all about the same things. Other terms uh, that other librarians may use or other researchers is seed articles, benchmark studies, validation articles, or your gold standard set. Let's take a step back quickly and just talk about what are known relevant studies, because sometimes people send them to me and they do not quite know what I'm talking about. So most researchers begin a project with at least some familiarity with the literature. Maybe you've read a landmark article. Maybe your mentor has recommended several articles. Maybe you found a recent study that's inspired this entire review. These studies are really valuable and more than just for background reading. They address your research question, they should meet your inclusion criteria, and the known sources represent the type of evidence that you're trying to identify in this exhaustive search. Possible places to find your first few known relevant studies are personal knowledge, prior reviews, clinical guidelines, expert recommendations, and when you do some preliminary searches. I'm going to stress here really quickly that I mean preliminary searching. This should by no means be your exhaustive searching. When we're doing preliminary searching, for known relevant articles. We're also testing the feasibility of the review. So we want to make sure, there's at least a handful of papers that will fill your inclusion exclusion criteria and you should move forward. These generally, you might do this in Google Scholar because that's a really great database that's searching the full text, even though it's not very reproducible. And so, but this is preliminary searching. I would urge you to be more precise in your searching here than exhaustive. And you're, like I said, just attempting to capture some additional articles, not necessarily to find everything. And so, to step back on this a little bit, we're gonna bold statement here, but all studies are not equally as helpful. When we're talking about known relevant studies, we're not really judging whether or not a paper is good or bad. Like you're not doing risk of bias on this paper yet. Instead, we're asking a very specific question. Would this study clearly belong in your review if the search is working correctly? The most useful studies for search development and validation are the ones that you can confidently say should be captured by your search strategy. If one study is only loosely related to your question, you wouldn't expect it to survive screening. That's not a particularly helpful paper to include in your test, in testing your search. This isn't about a hierarchy of evidence or an importance. It's about whether the study can reliably act as a test case for your search strategy. And again, I cannot stress this enough. They must meet your inclusion criteria. Oftentimes, teams send me papers, and when I test the search strategy for the review, I'm not able to pull in that paper. And when I go and I look at that paper more closely, it doesn't meet the inclusion criteria. If I build out a search after a validating article and it turns out that that paper is not relevant, we just added a lot more material for the team to screen. And if it needs to be in there, then those papers need to be screened. But if it's just adding additional terms that are not really related to your research question, then we're really adding to the amount of work that the team needs to do to accomplish their goal of publishing an evidence synthesis project. And so those papers being used as validating articles is not appropriate and is going to create a lot more work for you. So we definitely want to avoid that. Using known relevant studies to identify keywords. One of the most valuable uses of known relevant studies is terminology discovery. Most researchers describe concepts differently than database indexers or authors. Known relevant studies help reveal how the literature actually talks about the topic. When you're looking at the concepts in the databases that are helpful, the particular fields that I look at when I'm doing this is titles, abstracts, author keywords, subject headings, publication type potentially, although I will say with most evidence synthesis, if it's not limiting to randomized control trials, limiting by publication type is can be really problematic. You'll want to think about pseudonyms, alternative spellings, acronyms, emerging terminology within the title, abstract, author keywords, and subject headings. Although I'll say this emerging terminology, while super important, it's also important to think about historic terminology when creating an evidence synthesis search. So, for instance, if we were doing a research question and say we were looking at, a time trend paper on public health interventions for people who are unhoused. And I want all of the history of what the United States has done historically from 1776 to 2026. Right, super important. I have the whole history. I would need to think about all of the different time periods and how that they described this population. So developing the search strategy and only using the term people who are unhoused is not going to actually pull in historically the bulk of the material that we're looking for, right? So we would need to include homelessness, even if that's not a term that, is consistently used in the medical literature today. And if I'm interested in earlier works, I would have to think about how the researchers were describing this population then. So, for instance, I know that in the 60s and 70s, you'll see some papers where, you know, they're using less precise terminology for this. So, for instance, I've seen vagrant be used for people who are unhoused or people who have mental illness or people who have substance abuse issues. So, we might have to add in less precise terms, pull in more evidence, just because these terms are what historically was used and, they're not exactly what we're looking for. But if that's the terms that was used in the day, it's important that we add them in. Okay, so I think, this is probably what everyone is most excited for, tools to identify additional relevant studies. So you only know one study that meets your criteria, and you want to find additional studies to be your validating articles or your gold standard set. Or, you're just trying to judge the feasibility of the review before you take the time to write your protocol. Once we have the known relevant studies, at least one, we can use that study or studies as an entry point into the literature. Citation chaining allows us to move in two directions. We can look backwards to see what studies influence that paper, or we can move forward and see what newer studies cite it. And this can be a way to discover the terminology because we can look at kind of how things are being described based on this relationship. Tools like Research Rabbit and connected papers make this process more visual and intuitive, which can be really helpful for researchers who are new to evidence synthesis, or if your mind just works better if you're looking at a network map. This step can be particularly valuable when terminology varies across time or disciplines, like we talked about in the last slide with our people who are unhoused question. Because citation relationships often connect studies, even when keyword searching does not. And so you can harvest the data from the indexing to add additional terms to your search. You can also use database features in PubMed, like the similar articles, or in Web of Science and Scopus and Google Scholar, where we're looking at that direction of the chaining by seeing what papers cite the paper that you included or are cited by. Okay, so let's take a quick minute to think of an example as to why this is so important and how having validating articles can help us. Imagine we have a research question of, do wearable devices improve sleep quality? If we only searched for the term wearable device or devices, we might miss a whole bunch of studies that use different terminology. So if I, took our known studies, harvested the data within the indexing, I might identify additional words like smartwatches, fitness tracker, activity tracker, maybe even just the term like wearables. So it's really important for us to look at how it's being described so we know how large or narrow we can scope our keyword searches. And so it's just important to know how others are describing these items. Okay. Then once we have our known relevant studies or our gold standard set, we can use these papers in tools that can help us explore indexing and the search terms, which can be really helpful. We often assume that we already know, the right terminology, but indexing frequently reveals additional concepts or alternative language. And because some databases are using a controlled vocabulary, it's really important that we're capturing this right terminology. So for example, the Yale Mesh Analyzer allows us to upload a set of PubMed IDs and quickly see how those articles are consistently indexed. And so it will reveal the important subject headings, and we can then add those into our search. PubMed Reminder is another useful tool because it gives us a quick frequency view of both keywords and mesh terms across a set of studies. So we can look at those keywords and then see how things are being described based on frequency seen in the title and abstracts. The goal here is to bridge a gap between how researchers describe their work and how the databases actually index them. I'm going to just jump into a quick demo just to talk about what you would like, what things you should look at when you're attempting to do this work to better understand like what you're missing. So I just pulled one of my own papers because I'm familiar with it, so we can really talk about the indexing, right? So here we have a lot of indexed information. So the journal title, the page numbers, the affiliation, the PubMed ID number, the direct object identifier, all that stuff, right? We're not really looking at that. We only need to look at the title, which is at the top, and the abstract information to get a better idea of all of the information that we may want to look at here. If we go further down into the PubMed record, we'll see the similar articles section, and you can actually click the button here and it will load more information related to similar articles, and you can go through that material to see if any of these are relevant to your study. We keep scrolling down the PubMed record. We can see, we have our publication type. This is a systematic review because that's the type of research I publish. And further down is the mesh terms, which are those medical subject headings. So, if I was doing another review, I might want to go look at the mesh terms assigned to a relevant review because those potentially will have relevant information for me. Also, I want to highlight here the substances that can also be really helpful. If you're doing something with drug information, you may want to look to see how that's also being described in the database. So if we jump to a different database, I pulled the same exact record in Scopus. You can see same thing here. We have our title at the top, our abstract that will give us all this information. We can harvest this to find terminology to add into our search strategy. If we go further down into this, we can see that there's mesh terms here and then the M tree terms that could be potentially relevant that we would want to add. If we scroll right back up to the top, if we were trying to do our manual citation chaining, we have cited by at the top. And so this paper has been cited 8 times so far. And we could click on that and see what papers have cited the paper that I wrote, or I could click into the references and look at the 68 papers that we cited within this review. Okay, so let's look at a different paper, a different type of tool. This is a network map. And so same exact paper. And you can see that here we have our abstract in the background, in the right side view. So we could easily click into that to get an idea of additional keywords that we wanted to add into our search. Up at the top, we could click prior works or derivative works to get that cited by, cited with kind of idea. And so we could click within the network map to look at the title and abstracts of each of the papers that are connected to our paper. Okay, so this is the part that I always get most excited for, and this might not be as exciting for everybody else that's not a librarian, but I am going to tell you all about my favorite part of evidence synthesis searching. And that's when we get to use the known relevant articles as a quality assurance tool. So the workflow for this is that you're going to develop the search strategy. You want to run the search strategy, and then you want to check the retrieval of a known relevant study against that search strategy. And then if there's any papers that are in the database, very important part of this, needs to be in the database, but not in the search strategy results. This is important because we want to investigate why. How is this being described differently? And, what information needs to be added? We want to revise the search as needed. So we can do this as many times as we need to. So that way we can retrieve these papers if they're supposed to be, included, which is why it's so important that we're only including included studies that you would include in your paper. They are the perfect study in this process. So I created a quick validation table, and I purposefully left retrieved by concept A, B, and C here at the top because I didn't want to assign those. As you're filling this in, it may make sense for you to change this to what your populations are. So for instance, if your concept A is your population, you can change retrieve by population. Concept B might be your intervention. And so you would, so on, change those as you needed. You can add additional columns if you need them. So, your search may have more or less than 4 concepts, and you should add accordingly. But here, I have my validating citation, whether or not the citation was present in the database. Now, this is super, super important because every single citation isn't in every database. So we don't want to be trying to do this investigation and figuring out why these papers are not retrieved if the citation wasn't in the database to begin with, and it would not have been retrieved. Then we want to check whether or not it was retrieved by the full search. And then if it is not, we would combine each concept with that search of the paper, so that way we can see if it's, what section is it being lost in. So in this example for Smith et al. In 2023, we can see that it was not retrieved by concept B, which means that when I go to do my investigation, I would go and look to see what in concept B is missing. So if we scroll back to my example here about this study, you can see in the title, we call this acute pain management in people with opioid use disorder, right? But in the study selection, we're saying that we're evaluating acute pain interventions, not acute pain management interventions. So if in our search we had a very narrow scope, potentially we would miss this study if we didn't have it in both places. So the way that the papers being described by the researchers themselves is what lends itself to be found or not found when you're doing exhaustive searching. So it's important to think about all of the different ways what you're looking for can be described. All right, so if we scroll back into this. We would then go each concept, figure out why it's missing, and then we would potentially add additional keywords or subject headings that are going to pull this paper into our paper and hopefully find other similar articles that we don't know about. You can see in the next one, Jones has been found. We don't have to do any more investigation work after this. It was retrieved successfully. Check it off your list. Perfect. It's in your search results. Then we get to Miller. So Miller is not present in the database, so it's obviously not going to be retrieved by the full text. And so if the citation is not available in the database, I would recommend that you check out Ulrich's Web, which is a database that indexes journals and provides information about the indexing of journals. So you would check the journal name within Ulrich's Web, and then you could identify the databases that index this journal, and then consider adding those in your protocol as a database that you're searching. Okay, so pro tip here. I generally do not recommend using PubMed as a database for search validation. PubMed has significantly less journals coverage than other databases such as Embase, Web of Science, or Scopus. So in that database, you might find that a validating article may be absent due to indexing coverage rather than deficiencies in the search itself. So it's just important to note. One database that I think would be surprising to people that is really great at pulling in papers that are really hard to find is Google Scholar. So if you're having problems, you might want to check with Google Scholar to see if that would be retrieved by your search. And then if so, adding that to your database as well. And it's really great for gray literature searching as well. But it is one of the only databases that are looking at the full text of the paper instead of just the database indexing, so title, abstract, author, keywords, etc. Okay, so why do studies get missed? So our common reasons are they're using a pseudonym that you didn't include in your search strategy. You're missing a subject heading. You're using restrictive filters from the database. So typically you're not allowed to restrict your filters. So we can't just check the RCT box in PubMed. You would want to use a PubMed validated search strategy. Cochrane has one for RCTs. Typically, the restrictive filters within the database are not considered exhaustive enough for systematic review searching. So it's really important that you're not using those. It might also be field restrictions. So maybe you're only searching the title field, which again would not be exhaustive enough for systematic review. And the person described, the pseudonym or the terms that you included in their abstract, but you're not searching that field. So it's not being pulled in. Also human error. So there could be a spacing problem or a spelling error in your search. This isn't just human error on the person searching. This also might be human error on the person that wrote the abstract. It could be really poorly written. Their abstract may include spelling errors, and databases aren't really smart enough currently to know exactly what you're looking for. It's an exact match of of what information you put in. So if you are not being exhaustive and even, potentially using spelling errors, if they're done pretty frequently, you potentially could miss some literature. Okay, so if we take our whole idea, right, and we test a validating sample here, you can see that I used terms that were not used in the title of my review. Or in the abstract or author keywords. And those are the fields that we're searching with the TFKW here. So because of that, when we take my search strategy, which is searching for short-term pain and opioid addiction or addicts or, all the different word endings there, we are not pulling in these papers. So even though mine is on acute care versus short-term pain, and people with opioid use disorder versus an opiate addiction, it's not being pulled in because the terminology isn't an exact match. So our database didn't pull those in for us. So because of this, I would do some investigation work. I would add acute to line one. I would add use disorder or disorder to line two, and then I would get significantly more results. But I would also retrieve my search strategy and similar papers to my paper. Okay, so retrieving known relevant studies um, does have significant limitations. This process does not prove that your search is comprehensive. Think of it more as a quality assurance tool. It's a useful test, but not a perfect test. It's important to understand what they can and cannot tell us. If your search retrieves all your known relevant studies, it's encouraging. It suggests that your search is capable of finding at least some of the studies that meet your eligibility criteria. However, retrieving those studies does not prove that you've identified all the relevant literature. Let's take a look at some reason why. Many reviews only provide a handful of studies. Sometimes one or two articles. This is a problem with sample size. So the handful of studies that you give me, they may not represent the full range of terminology of the search concepts and subject headings. A search that retrieves three known studies may still miss dozens of relevant studies that use different language in their title and abstract. For example, if you know all of your known studies come out in the last 3 years, your search may not adequately capture older literature. Researchers also tend to know studies that they've already previously encountered. So those studies may come from a particular specialty, research group, journal, or geographic location. As the studies selected for validation may not represent the broader evidence base, for example, a cardiologist may provide some cardiology focused studies as their gold set standard, while missing relevant literature that's published in nursing, public health, or rehab journals. This can be problematic because each field may use different terminology for the same exact concept. Known relevant studies are often published in and are highly visible studies because you're not doing like deep dives to find these, right? We're really looking for those ones that are coming back from a very precise search. So evidence synthesis, though, should attempt to identify all relevant evidence, including studies that may be less visible. A validation set composed entirely of published positive studies may not help us identify missing gray literature or unpublished research. So important to note that we have to search different places, and also we may want to think about how things are being described to pull in this additional information. Okay, so I think this is one of the more important limitations, overfitting the search strategy. So sometimes researchers become so focused on retrieving their known studies that they unintentionally tailor the search too narrowly. The results of that search may perform well on the validation set, but poorly in the broader literature. So an analogy for this is I may study questions from, last year's exam, and I might do really well on those questions. But if different questions have been introduced since the last time I, picked up those questions and memorized them, you're not going to do well on the actual test itself. So it's important that we're not overfitting it and just making it so that it retrieves those papers individually and not the larger set of papers. So we really want to think, about the exact keywords we're including and making sure that all of those make sense. The goal here is not to retrieve all 5 of your validating articles. The goal is to build a search that's going to retrieve all relevant studies on a particular topic. Okay, so lots of information here, right? So the key takeaways is that known relevant studies can help with determining terminology, identifying indexing, support citation searching, and evaluate the performance of the search. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to chat. If you are at Yale, please feel free to contact me or reach out to your research and education librarian here, and we would love to chat with you about your evidence synthesis project and using validating articles to test your search strategy. I hope